The man who didn't want to be a legend. Laughter rolled through the studio like a wave, hitting the walls, the cameras, the ceiling. The band played a bright riff, the audience whooped on cue, and the big city skyline glowed on the screen behind them, pretending it was just an ordinary evening in New York. But behind the curtain, before the cameras went live, Keanu sat alone for a moment in the narrow hallway, feeling his heart beat a little too hard against his ribs. He knew how this worked. He had done it for decades. Walk on, smile, tell a story, sell a movie, leave. But tonight there was a soft, persistent thought in the back of his mind, a name he carried like something breakable: Alexandra. He'd watched the crew move around him with practiced speed, sound tech clipping a mic to his jacket, makeup artist patting away the shine, stage manager pointing to the tape mark on the floor. Everyone called him legend, icon, hero, and he nodded politely every time, but none of those words ever seemed to belong to him. He was the guy who stayed late to thank the lighting crew, who bought coffee for extras on cold shoots, who went home to quiet rooms and leftover takeout. The world saw the posters and the fight scenes. He felt the empty hotel beds, the funerals, the way grief never really left, only changed its weight. The first time he met Alexandra, there had been no spotlights, no screaming audience, just the low murmur of an art event where people pretended to understand paintings they barely glanced at. He noticed her before she noticed him, a woman standing in front of her own work, speaking to a small circle of listeners with a calm, steady conviction. Silver streaks in her hair, paint on her fingers, a voice that didn't rush to fill silence. She didn't act impressed when she realized who he was. She simply shook his hand and asked, "What did you feel when you looked at it?" Nobody ever asked him that. They usually asked about stunts, about sequels, about money. That night, in a small corner away from the noise, she'd seen him as something other than a product. Now, years later, he was sitting in a green room with a bottle of water going warm in his hand, knowing that in a few minutes the same woman would walk out beside him, not as a hidden part of his life, but as someone the world was desperate to label. He thought about all the times they'd promised each other, "We'll protect this. We won't let them turn us into a story they can chew and spit out." He remembered the quiet nights in her paint-stained studio, where they sat on the floor editing their book, eating toast she always burned by accident. In those rooms, he was Keanu Reeves. He was just a tired man who talked too slowly when he was nervous, who sometimes went silent when old pain grabbed his throat. And still, she stayed, patient, kind, never trying to fix him, just sitting close enough that he didn't feel like he was drowning. "Keanu, you're on in 30, someone called from the doorway. He stood up, smoothed his dark jacket, and forced his shoulders to relax. This was easy, he told himself. Walk out, shake hands, laugh a little. He could do that in his sleep. But underneath that practiced calm was a different fear, one he didn't share with anyone except Alexandra, the fear that by speaking her name on air, he might be opening a door the world would try to force its way through. He had watched the internet build and break people with the same hands. He'd seen comments about her age, her hair, her clothes, typed by people who had never looked into her eyes. Every cruel word felt like it had been thrown through his chest first. The band started playing louder. Jimmy finished his joke with the previous guest and turned toward the side of the stage. A camera light blinked red. Someone touched Keanu's arm, guiding him to his mark. As he stepped into the glare of the spotlights, the crowd erupted. He smiled, bowed his head slightly the way he always did, that small gesture of humility that had nothing to do with branding and everything to do with the fact that, deep down, he never got used to this level of attention. He shook Jimmy's hand, sat down, and answered the first questions easily. About the new movie, the fight choreography, a funny story about a stunt gone wrong. The audience laughed at every beat, and for a while he let the rhythm carry him. But between the jokes, between the cheers, his mind kept drifting to the woman watching from the wings. He knew exactly where she was standing, could almost feel the shape of her quiet presence just out of sight. There was a kind of courage in what she was doing tonight that nobody in the audience would fully understand. She was an artist who had never asked for this level of exposure, a private person who painted her feelings instead of tweeting them. Still, she had said yes when the invitation came, not because she wanted fame, but because she wanted to stand beside him to show that their connection wasn't something ugly or secret. "We'll do it our way," she had told him before they left for the studio. "No pretending, no lying, just enough truth to breathe." Jimmy leaned back in his chair and smiled, that familiar host smile that said he was about to change gears. The laughter from the last joke faded, and a different kind of silence filled the room, a silence that was almost anticipation. "You know," Jimmy said, looking at Keanu with a mixture of mischief and warmth, "people love you. They love your movies, they love your kindness memes, but lately they really love seeing you happy. And a lot of that happiness seems to show up when you're with Alexandra Grant." The audience did that soft, collective ooh, like a wave of curiosity washing over them. Cameras zoomed in. Somewhere backstage, Alexandra felt her stomach tighten. Keanu's smile faltered for half a second, the smallest crack in his carefully calm expression. This was the moment he'd been turning over in his mind for weeks. The question was simple, almost playful. But behind it lived all the headlines he'd learned to hate, all the strangers who thought they had a right to judge the way their love looked, all the painful memories that had taught him how quickly a beautiful thing could be broken. He could dodge it, he knew how. A light joke, a vague answer, a shrug. The audience would laugh, the show would move on, and their private world would stay in the shadows. But when he thought of doing that, he saw her face the night she'd told him, quietly, "I don't need you to hide me to keep me safe." She had never asked him to declare anything to the world. All she'd ever wanted was respect, both from him and from herself. So there he sat, under the burning studio lights, with millions of people waiting for something entertaining, while the most important decision in the room had nothing to do with entertainment at all. His fingers curled together in his lap, his shoulders dropped just a little, and he let his practiced smile fade into something more honest. For the first time that night, he didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let the audience feel that this was no longer a rehearsed story about a funny stunt. This was a man trying to decide whether he was brave enough to be gentle in front of the whole world. He drew in a slow breath, eyes flicking for the briefest second toward the dark edge of the curtain where he knew she stood. Then he turned back to Jimmy, to the cameras, to the sea of waiting faces, and opened his mouth to speak, knowing that whatever came out next could change not only how the world saw them, but how safe their love would feel when the bright lights went dark. The artist in the line of fire. The word Alexandra left his mouth so softly that, for a heartbeat, it sounded more like a thought than an answer. The audience leaned in, their laughter gone, replaced by a strange, collective stillness. He didn't hide behind a joke. He didn't shrug it off. He let her name sit in the air between them, fragile and real. "She's," he began, searching for something true and simple, "she's one of the kindest people I've ever known." It was the shortest sentence he could find that didn't feel like a lie, but inside that line lived years of small, unnoticed acts. Mugs of tea placed quietly on his desk. Long walks taken in silence when words hurt too much. Paintings that turned his unspoken grief into color. Backstage, Alexandra heard her name and felt a ripple move through her chest, a mix of tenderness and dread. She stood just beyond the curtain where the light faded into darkness, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the side monitor. She watched him as millions would watch him later, close up, every tiny shift in his face magnified. She knew his tells, the way his eyebrows softened when he was remembering something painful, the way he pressed his lips together when he was trying not to say too much. She had told herself she was ready for this, that she could handle being the woman next to Keanu Reeves in the public eye. But hearing him speak her name so gently, on a stage built for noise, made the whole thing feel more fragile than any canvas she'd ever stretched. The host grinned, sensing the audience's interest. "You light up when you talk about her, man," Jimmy said. "What is it about Alexandra?" The crowd gave another soft reaction, part teasing, part affectionate. Keanu exhaled through his nose, that tiny sigh he did when he was bracing himself. He could feel old instincts tugging at him, deflect, minimize, dodge. But another memory rose up, stronger than his fear. The night they had argued in her kitchen when the first photos of them holding hands hit the internet. She stood there in an oversized sweater, hair messy, eyes red from scrolling through hateful comments. "They talk about me like I'm a prop," she had whispered. "Like I don't have my own life, my own work." He had wanted to smash the phone, to run outside and shout at a sky that never answered. Instead, he'd taken the device quietly from her hand and placed it face down on the table. "You're not their story," he'd said. "You're your own. They don't get to decide what you are." That night, she had looked at him like he'd just handed her a small piece of armor. Tonight, on this bright set, he felt responsible for not tearing that armor away. So he answered carefully, but not lazily. "You know," he said, "the world can be really loud. Movies, internet, opinions, she's quiet in the best way. She reminds me to be present, to be kind, even when it hurts." That last part hung in the air. "Even when it hurts," Jimmy repeated, curiosity sharpening his tone. "What do you mean by that?" Now the moment wasn't just about romance. It was brushing up against something deeper: pain, loss, the cost of staying soft in a hard world. Keanu's eyes dropped for a second, and the monitor backstage showed Alexandra the familiar shadow crossing his features. He thought of funerals, of hospital rooms, of phone calls in the middle of the night. He thought of the way Alexandra never tried to erase his sorrow, never told him to move on or cheer up. Instead, she brought him books, left notes on the fridge, and sometimes just sat beside him on the floor, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in the same quiet. "Kindness is hard sometimes," he said slowly. "When you've lost people, when things fall apart, it's easier to shut down, to say, 'No more, I'm done.'" He shrugged almost apologetically, as if confessing a weakness. "But she doesn't shut down. She keeps showing up for people, for her work, somehow for me." The audience didn't clap right away. Their faces shifted, some softened, some grew serious. This wasn't the glossy, edited version of love they were used to seeing on screens. This was a man admitting he was tired, that he'd thought about closing his heart, and that someone had quietly refused to let him. Backstage, Alexandra's throat tightened. She had never wanted to be anyone's savior. She was just a woman who had learned, through her own bruises, that gentleness was a decision you made over and over, especially when you had every excuse to stop. Hearing him say it out loud made that private decision suddenly feel very public. Jimmy, balancing between sincerity and showmanship, decided to push a little further. "So," he said, grinning but with a glint of real interest, "are we talking serious romance here, or are you just giving us very poetic friendship vibes?" The crowd exploded in laughter and cheers, some people shouting, "Tell us!" or "Say it!" This was the moment the show wanted: the label, the headline, the meme. Keanu felt the pressure clamp around his chest like a vice. He knew how quickly their lives could be reduced to a three-word caption: "Keanu confirms romance." All the nuance, all the nights of doubt and slow trust would vanish under that flat, shiny sentence. For a heartbeat, he almost did what was expected. He nearly chuckled, shrugged, dropped a vague, charming line. But then he remembered something Alexandra had said when they first started being seen together. They had been walking down a side street, trying to avoid photographers, when she stopped suddenly and looked him in the eye. "I won't pretend you're just a co-worker," she had said. "Not to make anyone else comfortable, if you ever feel like you have to. Make me smaller out there to protect me, tell me. I'd rather step away than become a ghost in my own life." He looked straight into the camera now, feeling the heat of the lights but also a strange clarity. "I don't know what label people want," he said, voice low, steady. "I just know I'm grateful she's in my life, and I love the way she moves through the world." It wasn't a confession, not in the dramatic way tabloids wanted. But it was something more dangerous, more honest. A public admission of respect, of admiration, of a bond he refused to cheapen into a soundbite. The audience responded with softer applause, a few emotional awes. They seemed to understand, at least a little, that this answer cost him something. Backstage, Alexandra's eyes burned. "I love the way she moves through the world." Of all the things he could have said, talented, beautiful, brilliant, he had chosen the one that saw her whole, beyond age and appearances and industry rules. It was the kind of sentence a person could carry on bad days, like a stone warmed by someone else's hand. For a moment, she felt a rush of courage. Maybe they could do this, she thought. Maybe they could let in just enough light without being set on fire. And then, almost casually, Jimmy turned his head toward the wings and said the words that shifted everything. "Well, you know," he laughed, "we've been talking about her. Why don't we ask her ourselves? Alexandra, would you join us?" The band hit a quick, bright sting. The audience shot to their feet with fresh energy, cheering, clapping, reaching for their phones. A spotlight swung away from Keanu and cut through the darkness to land directly where she stood. In an instant, the safety of the shadows vanished. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had agreed to come out tonight, but she hadn't known exactly when this moment would hit. This slow walk from the wings to center stage, from being a private person to a public image. For half a second, she thought about turning away, about shaking her head no and disappearing back down the hallway. But then she felt decades of her own work behind her. Years spent painting vulnerable bodies, writing about visibility and shame, telling people in quiet gallery talks that their softness mattered. If she ran now, what would she be saying to every person who had listened? She straightened her back. The spotlight was blinding, yes, but it was also a test she'd been quietly training for her whole life. She took her first step toward the couch, the cheers growing louder with every footfall, her mind racing with one fierce, trembling question. When she finally opened her mouth in front of all these strangers, would she be brave enough to stay exactly who she was? Or would the weight of the world's gaze turn her into someone she didn't recognize? The weight of being seen. The first step out from behind the curtain felt heavier than any step she had taken into a gallery, into a boardroom, into a lover's apartment. The spotlight washed over Alexandra like a sudden wave of snow, erasing the edges of the room. The audience was just a blur of shapes and raised phones, but she could hear them, clapping, cheering, some shouting her name as if they knew her. She held her hands lightly at her sides, not hiding them, not clutching them. Pain-stained fingers, silver hair, the lines at the corners of her mouth. She didn't try to smooth any of it away. If she was going to do this, she would come as the woman she had worked hard to become, not as a filtered version built for someone else's comfort. When she reached the couch, Jimmy stood and offered a quick, friendly hug. It grounded her more than she expected. Underneath the host persona, he was just a man who understood what it meant to walk into a room full of strangers every night. Keanu rose, too, and for a split second their eyes met. There was no big gesture, no dramatic embrace, just a small, almost private nod he gave her. "I see you. I'm here." It was the same look he gave her in the studio when she nailed a difficult line in a book, or when she finally solved a problem on a canvas that had been fighting her for weeks. She sat beside him, smoothing her red dress beneath her knees as she did, aware that somewhere tonight someone would pause the screen and judge that choice, too. "Alexandra Grant, everybody," Jimmy announced, and the room erupted again. She smiled, not the forced, toothy grin she'd practiced in the bathroom mirror earlier, but a softer curve that admitted, yes, this is overwhelming, and I'm surviving it. Jimmy asked the first easy questions, about her art, about how she and Keanu met. She talked about their book, about late nights arguing over commas and images, about how he showed up to her studio with quiet respect, not star power. Her sentences were measured, her voice calm, but inside she was tracking 100 tiny dangers. Don't sound ungrateful, don't sound like you're bragging, don't sound like you're apologizing just for existing beside him. As she spoke, she could feel two versions of herself battling in her chest. One was the young artist who used to shrink at openings, who believed every critic who called her too intense, too strange, too much. The other was the woman who had, over the years, built herself back out of clay and ink and therapy sessions, who had learned to stand alone on stages and defend work that made people uncomfortable. That second woman whispered now, "Remember who you are. You were whole before this couch. You'll be whole after it." Jimmy shifted the conversation, his tone softening. "You know, Alexandra," he said, "the world kind of discovered you through photos with this guy." He jerked his thumb playfully toward Keanu. The crowd laughed, but there was an undercurrent of something else, curiosity, judgment, hope. "A lot of people said seeing you two together changed how they think about love in Hollywood. It's different from the usual story. How does that feel?" There it was, the question she had known was coming, but that still hit like a small punch to the chest. Different, she knew what that meant. Older, not polished. Not what we expected. She had read the comments. Why her? She looks like he could have anyone. All those unfinished sentences holding the same ugly root. You don't fit the fantasy we built for him in our heads. She could lie, she could say she didn't care, that she never read any of it. But she had promised herself, no lies, even if the truth had to come out in pieces. She glanced at Keanu. His hands were relaxed, but his jaw was tight, that small sign of anger he never let fully bloom. He hated the way they talked about her as if she couldn't see the words herself. She turned back to Jimmy, to the camera, to the invisible millions, and forced herself to breathe. "I think," she said slowly, "that people love stories more than they love facts." She let a small, wry smile show. "They see a photo and write an entire screenplay in their heads, who we are, why we're together, what we talk about, what we feel. Sometimes those stories are kind, sometimes they're cruel, but they're almost never honest." She shrugged slightly, not dismissing it, just acknowledging its weight. Real relationships are much quieter. There are dishes and deadlines and arguments about who used the last of the coffee. There are days you're not photogenic at all. The crowd laughed gently. And they're sitting in the same room for hours, saying almost nothing but knowing you're not alone. The room settled. Keanu watched her, pride and worry warring in his eyes. He knew exactly how many nights she'd stayed up reading the world's opinions of her, no matter how many times she swore she wouldn't look. He had seen the way she'd tried to joke about it, only to fall silent halfway through the sentence. This was the first time she had spoken about it this openly, and she was doing it on national television. Jimmy, sensing the depth, decided not to skate away. "But you do see it, right?" he asked quietly. "The comments, the pressure, the judgment, does it ever make you think, this is too much, I should just disappear from the picture?" It was a brutal question if you stripped the TV gloss off it. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the lights, the audience shifted uncomfortably. Some of them had written exactly that kind of comment once, alone in their rooms, not expecting to be confronted with the living, breathing human on the other side of the screen. Her first instinct was to deflect, to laugh, to say, "Oh, I don't read that stuff." But a different memory rose up. A night months ago when she had sat on her bathroom floor with her back against the tub, phone in her hands, scrolling. Headlines about her hair, her face, her clothes, paragraphs of strangers diagnosing her, deciding her worth. She felt her chest tighten, that familiar old voice whispering, "They're right. You are wrong. Wrong shape, wrong age, wrong everything." Then Keanu had knocked softly on the door, sat down on the other side, and slipped a note under the crack. In his slow, careful handwriting it said, "You're not made for their frame. Stop trying to fit inside it." She looked straight into the camera now, as if she were talking back through every screen that had ever misused her image. "Yes," she said, "of course it gets to me. I'm not made of stone. When people talk about you like you're an object, like you're a mistake, it hurts." Her voice trembled on that word, but she didn't pull back. "There are days you want to hide, to say, 'Fine, you win. I'll go back to being invisible.'" She paused, letting that sink in for herself as much as for anyone listening. "But then I remember I spent years fighting to be visible at all. As an artist, as a woman, as a person who doesn't fit the mold. I won't hand that fight back just because some stranger thinks they know what enough looks like." The applause that rose up wasn't the wild, screaming kind. It was slower, heavier, almost grateful. In the first row, someone wiped their eyes. On the couch, Keanu's shoulders eased a fraction, but his eyes glistened. He wanted to reach over and take her hand, but he also knew she needed to stand on her own here. So instead, he just angled his body a little toward her, a quiet, physical statement. "I'm with her." Jimmy nodded, visibly moved. But the producer in his earpiece was already whispering time codes, reminding him there were ad breaks, contracts, a show flow to protect. "So, with all that," he asked gently, "why stay in it? Why stay in something the world keeps poking at?" It was the question underneath every other question. Why is he with her? Why is she with him? Why keep going when you have every reason to walk away? Alexandra felt the weight of it settle on her ribcage. She knew her answer mattered, not just to their story, but to 1,000 unseen viewers who felt like they were too something to be loved in the light. She parted her lips to speak. "Because," she began, and the word came from somewhere very deep, somewhere that remembered every lonely night before this man walked into her studio. But before she could finish, the music slammed in, loud, bright, mechanical. The red light on the main camera blinked off. Jimmy's practiced voice cut across her sentence. "We'll hear more from Alexandra and Keanu right after the break." The audience jumped to their feet, clapping on cue, the request for commercials swallowing her unfinished thought. Her because hung in the air, sliced neatly in half. The applause washed over her without meaning. On the monitor, she saw herself frozen mid-word, eyes soft, mouth open. She realized that for everyone watching at home later, this would look like suspense, like a neat little cliffhanger. But for her, in this exact moment, it felt like being yanked away from something sacred just when she'd found the courage to touch it. As the lights dimmed for the ads and the studio shifted into its in-between state, she sat there on the couch, heartbeat pounding in her ears, wondering if she'd lost the fragile thread of honesty she'd finally managed to grab. And somewhere inside her, a new fear uncoiled. When the cameras came back on and the world leaned in again, would she still be brave enough to finish that sentence? Or would the interruption be all it took to make her hide the rest of the truth forever? The answer that didn't fit the script. The second the show cut to commercials, the room exhaled. The music dropped, the cameras went dark, and the audience shifted in their seats, talking softly, stretching their legs. On the couch, Alexandra stared at the floor for a beat, the ghost of her unfinished words still hanging on her tongue. Because she'd finally opened the door and the machinery of television had slammed it halfway shut. "You okay?" Keanu's voice was low for her ears only. Up close, with the lights slightly dimmed, he looked less like the myth printed on posters and more like the man who forgot where he left his glasses and overtipped at coffee shops. There was worry in the lines around his eyes. "I hate unfinished sentences," she said, trying to make it a joke. Her smile came out crooked, bittersweet. She wasn't angry at Jimmy, not really. She could see the apology in the way he kept glancing at her, one hand pressed to the earpiece where the producers lived. It wasn't cruelty, it was systems, timers, ad buyers, but it still hurt, the way a deep conversation hurts when a phone alarm cuts through it. Jimmy leaned toward them, voice softer now that the microphones weren't hot. "I'm sorry," he said. "They were screaming break in my ear. If you want to change the subject after this, I get it." Alexandra surprised herself by shaking her head. "No," she said, feeling an unexpected steadiness rise in her chest. "I think I need to finish the thought, for me." Keanu watched her closely. She had that look he'd seen before in the studio, standing in front of a half-finished painting she was too afraid to ruin. The look that came right before she picked up the brush anyway. He wished he could absorb the impact for her, stand between her and every screen this moment would play on later. But he also knew that stepping in too far would be its own kind of harm, the kind that made her seem like a side character in her own story. The stage manager called time. "We're back in 30, 29. Lights brightened. The band settled. The crowd hushed, sensing something different about the energy on stage. Alexandra straightened in her seat, wiped the corner of one eye with a careful finger, and folded her hands in her lap so they wouldn't shake. "We're back with Keanu Reeves and Alexandra Grant," Jimmy said as the red light blinked on once more. His smile was still there, but his eyes were softer, almost protective. "Before the break, Alexandra, you were in the middle of saying something important. You started with because, and then we rudely cut you off." Light laughter. He let it fade quickly. "If you still want to finish that sentence, we'd really like to hear it." The studio went very still. Alexandra looked past Jimmy, past the cameras, into that invisible ocean of living rooms and phones and laptops. Somewhere out there, she knew, was a teenager staring at their reflection, counting all the ways they believed they weren't enough. Somewhere, someone in a tired marriage wondered if they'd missed their one chance at being fully seen. Somewhere, someone her own age had already decided that love like this wasn't for people like them. "Why is it worth it?" she repeated quietly, picking up the thread. "Why stay when it would be so much easier to step back into the shadows?" She let herself feel the fear, and then chose not to obey it. "Because," she said, and this time the word came out clear, "I spent too many years thinking I had to earn the right to be loved in the open. I thought if I looked younger or more polished or less myself, then maybe I'd be allowed to stand next to someone wonderful and not feel like a mistake." She felt her throat tighten, but she kept going. "And then I met a person who didn't ask me to become smaller or quieter or cut pieces off myself to fit some fantasy. He just pulled up a chair in my real life and stayed." Her voice wavered, but she didn't soften the next part. "So when the world comments, when people decide they know what's appropriate or believable for him, I want to run, yes. But I also remember I'm not just running from noise, I'd be running from the one place I've ever felt completely seen." She gave a tiny, helpless shrug. "And to me, that's worth staying for. That's worth fighting for." The response was not the wild whooping the show usually chased. It was something quieter, deeper. A few seconds of silence, and then applause that gathered slowly, like people standing up one by one inside themselves. Some audience members were visibly crying. Others clapped with their lips pressed tight, as if admitting something to themselves they weren't ready to say out loud. Keanu swallowed hard. He had heard versions of these thoughts at 3 in the morning, in kitchens and on walks and in the low light of hotel rooms. Hearing them here in this neon arena of performance made his chest ache. Jimmy turned to him. "How does it feel," he asked gently, "to know that that's what you are to someone?" Keanu looked at Alexandra, not at the camera. "It feels like a responsibility," he said. "The best kind, but still a responsibility. People say a lot of nice things about my work, but I know I've failed in a lot of small, human ways. I shut down, I disappear into myself, I say the wrong thing." He ran a thumb along the edge of his knee, grounding himself. She's seen all of that, and she still sits beside me, so I wake up every day trying to be worthy of the seat next to her. Not the other way around. For a moment, the legend disappeared entirely, and what remained was a man admitting how scared he was of not living up to someone's trust. Alexandra's eyes flooded. She blinked but didn't look away. This was their real language, less about declarations, more about choices repeated quietly over time. Jimmy glanced at the countdown clock and made a decision that would cost the show a neat, playful game segment, but might give the night something more lasting. He ignored the signal to move on and asked one last question instead. "A lot of people watching," he said, "feel like they're too much or not enough for love. Too old, too weird, too broken, too invisible. If each of you could say one thing to that person right now, what would it be?" Keanu shifted, about to defer to Alexandra, but she raised a hand slightly. "I'll go first," she said, surprising them both. She leaned a little closer to the camera, as if narrowing the distance between herself and whoever needed this. "You are not a draft," she said. "Your life is not a rough version waiting to be acceptable. You don't start deserving love after you hit a goal weight or land a dream job or get your anxiety under control." Her voice was firm now. "The people who are right for you will meet you exactly where you are and grow with you. If someone needs you to disappear, to pretend, or to be ashamed of existing as you, that is not love. That is fear wearing a nice outfit." Keanu smiled, a soft, proud curve that reached his eyes. "I'd add this," he said. "Don't give up on gentle people. They might be quiet or awkward, or they might not fit whatever the internet is selling as perfect. But they're the ones who sit with you when things hurt. And if you are that gentle person and the world keeps telling you to harden up or get mean to survive, please don't. Your softness is not the problem. The problem is a world that doesn't know what to do with kindness unless it can sell it." The band was supposed to start playing. Nobody moved. Jimmy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I feel like we all just had therapy on national television," he said, half laughing, half serious. The audience laughed with him, wiping eyes, hugging their own arms. For once, the show's usual rhythm took a back seat to something simpler. People in a room, recognizing themselves in someone else's fear and someone else's courage. They wrapped the segment, plugs for the movie for Alexandra's upcoming show, a final wide shot of the three of them laughing. The credits rolled. The cameras stopped. The crowd filed out slowly, many of them strangely quiet as they checked their phones and walked into the night. Backstage, in the narrower light of the hallway, everything felt smaller again. The air smelled like coffee and cables. Alexandra leaned against the wall for a second, letting her shoulders drop. The adrenaline was wearing off. Underneath it was a deep, buzzing vulnerability. She had shown more than she'd ever planned to. Keanu stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "You were incredible," he said simply. No big speeches, just a steady, honest tone. "I almost lost my nerve when the break cut in," she admitted. "For a second I thought, maybe that's a sign, maybe I should shut up." "But you didn't," he said. "You came back." He looked at her like he was seeing the whole of her, the shaking, the courage, the history behind both. "That's what you do, you come back." Jimmy appeared then, no cards in his hands, just a bottle of water and an earnest expression. "Hey," he said. "Thank you for trusting the show with that. We don't always get moments like that, you know." "Thank you for letting me finish," Alexandra replied. There was exhaustion in her voice, but also a quiet satisfaction. "Most of my life, I've had other people finishing my sentences for me." He winced a little, understanding more than he said. "Not tonight," he answered. "Tonight they're all going to replay that answer 1,000 times." And he was right. In the days that followed, clips of the segment spread across the internet. Headlines tried to shrink it, Keanu's emotional confession, Alexandra's powerful message, but the comments underneath told a bigger story. People wrote about marriages they'd stayed in out of fear, about bodies they'd hated for years, about giving up on love because no one in the movies ever looked like them. Some typed, "I didn't know I was allowed to want love that doesn't make me feel small." Others simply wrote, "Thank you, I needed this." In art studios and office cubicles, on buses and in bedrooms lit by phone screens, strangers replayed the moment where an aging artist with paint on her hands said, "I won't disappear to make you comfortable." And a tired movie star admitted he was trying every day to be worthy of her staying. It wasn't flawless. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was two imperfect people refusing to trade their tenderness for an easier story. And somewhere far from the noise, maybe in a quiet kitchen where toast was burning again, or in a studio that smelled like turpentine and coffee, Keanu and Alexandra went back to their ordinary life. They argued about commas and grocery lists. They got tired and cranky. They laughed until their sides hurt over something no audience would ever find funny. They held hands when no one was looking, not for cameras, not for proof, just because it still felt like a miracle to find another human hand that fit. The world would keep talking. It always did. But beneath all that chatter, beneath the clips and the headlines and the analysis, one simple, stubborn truth remained. You can walk into the loudest room on earth, be seen from every angle, and still protect the part of you that knows what real love feels like. It does not glamorize you. It does not erase you. It does not ask you to turn down your light or stand in someone else's shadow. Real love, they had just shown millions of people, is the courage to stay kind in a world that keeps telling you not to be, and the grace to sit beside someone on the hardest nights and say, with your presence if not your words, you are not a mistake for being exactly who you are.